these are just some of the impressive profiles that are pulled across the 10,000 students that Kairos has served to date. Um, oh, we have Julia, who's going to be attending Duke next year. She's not only an exceptional student academically, but she's also a gifted visual artist, a classical singer. She's also the founder of a service organization that brings arts to her community. So you can see that here. Um, we also have Richard, who is also exceptional academically as a baseline, but he took his passion for robotics to another level by raising over $70,000 for his school robotics club, impacting hundreds of students directly and creating opportunities for all of them in STEM education. And already at the high school level, he's thinking about scaling these kinds of opportunities across an entire population. One of his deep hobbies is like um, urban planning and how to design smart cities of the future. So some pictures of Richard out there in the field and his amazing achievements. And then we've got Catherine, who's got a uh, unusual global mindset for someone so young. She has actually spearheaded a task force to bring menstrual products to underserved populations in the world, and she's continuing her work at Princeton University. She's a U.S. Congressional Award Gold Medal recipient. She's also an accomplished athlete and a writer as well. Um, and you can see that she uses these incredible communication abilities that she has to really make a difference in the world. Um, and so you might be thinking, oh, this is really hard. These projects sound Herculean. They sound like they take months to develop. That sounds wonderful for but I'm just trying to survive BC calculus and my test next week. But that's okay because here at Kairos, we have developed a lot of expertise around student projects, like the science of passion projects, how you find the time, how you find the focus, how you find the energy, how you sustain through challenges, and how you develop that muscle, like your endurance and your ability to commit to something big and actually make it happen. And just to inspire you, here are some examples of actually final student projects that we've developed from some of our other programs after just a few weeks. So not only were these projects developed in a really, really compact time frame, they actually show admissions officers and future employers rather than just tell them about your domain knowledge, your AI skills, and your EQ. So your ability to recognize opportunities in the world and seize them. Um, so let's talk about your dreams. Do you have a big idea? Anything in particular that you'd like to pursue? Whether it's academic or creative, extracurricular, or personal. And I just like to uh, inspire you with some of these possibilities. Uh, Publishing a short paper, like a short story or a paper, serving a nursing home or even a prison. This is actually a project that I had when I was in high school, and I actually took it to my undergrad institution, which is Dartmouth. Found a magazine or a club in your school. We've had students who actually created their own literary magazine, um, or maybe produce a play, start an art show if you love the visual arts. Create a viral newsletter. We actually had a student um, who discovered ed tech as a field and then created a whole newsletter around ed tech and actually got thousands of parents to subscribe to it. Invent a new product and pursue a patent. Um, Empower younger students with mentoring. Sometimes it can be just helping your fellow classmates actually master a subject that you love. Whether it's calculus or maybe public speaking. Public speaking is one of those things that people are very nervous about. Maybe it's about partnering with a local museum, to create an exhibit on something that matters to you. So just like to share some ideas. And now I am so excited to turn it over to our our speaker for this evening, Katie Langhorst. She comes from an incredible background in education. She was a former VP of partnerships at Study Point, and she is an expert in executive function. She has degrees from Yale University, from Lesley University as well. She's a former classroom teacher. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thank you. Thanks, Christina. Let me just pull my screen up. There we go. Okay, great. So I think that was all super relevant to what we're going to talk about and really kind of tie it all together. So as Christina talked through all of the amazing possibilities that AI has built in our society, those things are wonderful, as she said, but one key piece of it is how does executive function, which will be our topic for the rest of this evening, tie into that? Because all those things can be great. If you don't have the underlying executive function skills to manage those things, it can be really, really challenging. So that's going to be our focus for the next little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about executive function and kind of what it is. It's a term that's thrown around in education a lot, but isn't always clear. So we'll talk about that. Then we're going to really dive into, let's imagine you have one of those fabulous ideas Christina talked about. How do you start to think about how to break that project into steps, how to manage your time, how to handle feedback, how to map out a plan? Basically, how do you use executive function and kind of build those muscles to help you achieve your project, your goal, your passion, whatever it happens to be? And I'll leave a little time for Q&A at the end as well. So let's start with just a basic introduction. I talk about executive function a lot, and parents often have differing ideas of what it is. So these are my kind of three favorite analogies to really understand what executive function is. Executive function, you can think about it in any of these three ways. One is kind of the conductor of an orchestra. So if you think about what a conductor does, the conductor's job is to make sure the instruments come in and leave at the right time, they're playing at the right speed or playing at the right pitch, are kind of unified in their music. That's what executive function does in your brain. It helps kind of coordinate all these different thoughts and pieces and ideas and emotions and kind of channel them into a consistent piece of music. Another way to think about it is a project manager. Same idea, right? A project manager's job is to lay out a sequence of tasks, follow steps. We'll talk a bunch about that in a second as it relates to students' projects. But the project manager's job is to kind of keep everything on track, resist distractions, kind of keep everybody moving. Again, that's a lot of what executive function does in your brain. A third analogy, and one super relevant to Kyros, is it's kind of the GPS of your brain, right? If you think of Kyros as the GPS of college admissions, the executive function is the GPS of your brain. Again, giving you a map, avoiding detours, helping you kind of avoid traffic, get where you're going. So that's kind of how executive function works in your brain. Let's dive one level deeper and talk about what does that actually mean? What are the different pieces and the components that make up executive function? So researchers in this field have basically kind of narrowed executive function to three main categories of things. The first one is working memory. This one's usually pretty familiar to most folks. It's essentially the ability to hold something in mind while you're doing something with it. So it could be holding a mathematical formula in mind while you complete a problem. It could be reading through a paragraph or a passage, kind of holding the beginning part in mind as you get towards the end, holding a main idea in mind as you're talking through a public speaking or a debate or an argument, that kind of thing. So that's working memory. And that's a really key piece to kind of everything that comes after it. Thinking about what Christina talked about in AI, if you can't hold those pieces in mind, again, not the facts and figures, those AI will hold in its mind for you. But if you can't keep in mind where you're trying to do, where you're trying to head, what your goal is, it's going to be really hard to use those AI tools well. The second category of kind of core components of executive function is flexible thinking. So this is just what it sounds like, being able to think flexibly, being able to adapt, being able to adjust. So this is where some of that EQ that Christina mentioned comes into play. If you're working on a project on a team and you start to realize, oh, yikes, this isn't going so well, there are problems here, being able to be flexible in your approach and in your thinking to adapt. So that's a key component of executive function. And then the third key bucket is inhibitory control, which is basically a fancy way of saying avoiding distractions. So when you're going down a road towards a passion project or trying to write a literary magazine, trying to plan a project, you have to be able to avoid all of the distractions that exist in modern life. This is harder today in 2025 than it has ever been in the history of humans. I think it's safe to say that. There are so many distractions for us as adults, for students, notifications, interruptions, emails, so many things flying at you all day long, that having that inhibitory control to be able to kind of block it out when you need to, focus on what you're doing, know how to use those things in a productive way, is a super important component of executive function. So those are kind of the three key pieces: that working memory, the flexible thinking, and then the inhibitory control. To go just one level deeper, and then we'll get to some practical stuff, executive functions researchers divide these again into kind of two sets of skills, what they call the foundational skills and then the kind of more advanced skills. Foundation skills are a lot of what we just talked about and kind of fall into those categories. Things like response inhibition, being able to stop and think. Christina talked about, asking ChatGPT a question and just taking it and running with it, right? That's not using your response inhibition of, let me read this paragraph that I asked ChatGPT to write for me and make sure it makes sense, make sure it's appropriate for the situation. So using your responsive inhibition is a key piece. Working memory, which we talked about, is considered a foundational skill. Emotional control, something all of us struggle with at moments, right? The ability to manage and control your emotions and to be able to kind of harness or channel them productively, right? Something that every human on earth that I know is always working on, for sure, but is a key developing skill in those teenage years. Flexibility, we talked about, adjusting to changes that come up when you're working through something. Sustained attention. There's been a lot of studies in the last 10 or 15 years about humans' attention span, even adults' attention spans are dramatically different today in 2025 than they were in the past. Again, because of all of the things coming at us, right? YouTube has continuously decreased the length of the videos that are most popular on their platform. I think they're down to like 40 seconds because that's what most people can focus for or choose to focus for on a particular topic. So being able to sustain attention for longer than that to achieve something that's your goal or your project is super important. And then the last one of the foundational skills is what's called task initiation, which is basically starting without procrastinating, right? Again, something all of us as adults have moments of struggling with, but the ability to just get going is considered kind of a foundational executive function skill. Then the next set are called the advanced skills, which kind of builds on those as sort of a second layer. And those are things that we'll talk about a bunch in a second. Things like planning and prioritization, being able to lay out a roadmap of steps back to the kind of GPS of your brain. What does a GPS do? It lays out literally a roadmap for you and a series of steps to kind of get you to your goal. Organization, being able to use systems and processes and find systems and processes that work for you to be able to organize yourself. Key thing in being able to achieve goals, projects. Time management. This is a huge one. I could talk for 3 hours just on time management, but this is a big one. And again, relates to some of the ones on the previous slide, like task initiation and avoiding distractions. How can you block out time in your calendar to achieve some of those fantastic things that Christina mentioned? Those require a lot of time management to be able to really lay out how are you going to spend time on a passion project when your BC Calculus exam is calling your name, and how to balance those things. Goal-directed persistence, that's kind of the stick-to-itiveness, is a term used a lot in education. Being able to persist through a whole lot of steps. None of those student profiles that you saw achieve those things in an hour or a day. Those are all long-term projects and goals that they built on over time. Again, using that executive function skill of goal-directed persistence. And then the last one, which is really kind of the biggest one in many ways, is the fancy word for it is metacognition, kind of taking a bird's eye view and self-monitoring your own thinking and your own work habits. This is something that's hard and that takes a long time to develop. Again, many adults are still working on it, but it's the ability to say, okay, I chose this organizational system to manage my time. It seemed like it was going to work. It's not working for me. Why? Am I not implementing it well? It does just not fit with my job, my lifestyle, my project. So the ability to kind of self-monitor your own use of executive function skills and adapt, and back to the flexible thinking, adapt and adjust. And that's something that is an important thing for teenagers to start to focus on, because the more you can kind of think about your thinking, which is what metacognition is, the better you'll be at figuring out where your deficits are in your executive function skills and how to improve them. Let's talk just for a few seconds about the difference between executive function and study skills. These two things are often confused, and they relate to each other, but they're a little different. So executive function is kind of defined as the broad cognitive processes that help someone to manage their tasks and responsibilities. So these are things that are fundamental to everything you do in life, from getting up in the morning and doing your morning routine of, brushing your teeth and exercising and getting dressed. That's executive function, to influencing your behavior, your decision making, your kind of emotional regulation. So executive function is sort of a core fundamental skill that can go across many domains, all domains really. Study skills are a little different, although they're related for sure. Study skills tend to be specific techniques for academic material. So this is things like a note-taking technique, using the Cornell method for note-taking, or, how to develop a quiz to help you learn vocabulary for a foreign language exam. Things focus specifically on academic skills, more related to kind of applying knowledge and using things in an academic context. And these typically need to be explicitly taught to students. Some students figure them out on their own, but the majority of students need explicit instruction in study skills to make sure that they have those fundamental skills kind of prepared and those muscles strong, especially as they transition from middle school to high school, which is a key place where typically the workload goes up. So these two things are related for sure, but they're kind of different flavors of a similar thing. So let's start talking about got all this theory and all the kind of scholarly side. Let's talk a little bit about how you can use executive function and how you can identify weaknesses in executive function when you're trying to achieve something, and whether that's a project, an academic goal, an extracurricular goal. One of the key pieces is figuring out what the goal is and then breaking that project, that goal, into manageable steps. So let's talk about how executive function kind of interacts with each of these different areas. So working memory, how does working memory relate to figuring out how to lay out the steps for a passion project? Some of these are pretty obvious, but I think it's helpful to think through exactly which executive function skills you're using and where you as a student, or your student if you're the parent, may see weaknesses that may need support and tools. Because ultimately the goal is to use all of these executive function skills in concert, that conductor of the orchestra, to achieve your project. So when we're talking about working memory, the key here is really to think about keeping the end goal in mind, literally holding it in your brain for a long period of time in some cases. And that can be challenging. Again, it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to lose some of that task-based persistence. So being able to keep the focus area top of mind, super important. So strategies that can help with this are things as simple as writing your goal on a Post-it and sticking it on your computer monitor or your laptop. Super small thing, stick it on your bathroom mirror, another place I've seen students do it, to kind of keep that present and kind of give your working memory that support of, this is why we're doing these things, is to get to this outcome. Working on sequencing tasks logically is key, and being able to switch between details and big picture and really tracking your progress. So all of these are key elements of planning a project that really tax and use your working memory pretty significantly. Flexible thinking, huge if you're talking about a long-term goal or a long-term project. A couple different ways that this tends to come into play. One is being able to find alternatives if one approach fails. So again, this is the very definition of flexible thinking, right? I guarantee you, every single one of you, when you work through what your passion project or your goal is going to be, you're going to hit barriers along the way. There are going to be unexpected roadblocks, whether that's, you tried something that didn't work, the timing that you thought you had didn't end up working out, you didn't get the mentoring or advising that you were hoping for and had to adjust. So these are all different aspects of a project that use flexible thinking, finding alternatives, switching between tasks. Maybe you're working on a literary magazine, you have to switch between writing and layout and marketing and figuring out how you're going to get it printed. So those all are pretty significant flexible thinking tasks. Being able to reorder your tasks if deadlines shift is super important. Again, things happen, you get delayed, things take longer than you think. So students who have strong flexible thinking abilities are able to adjust. Seeing multiple perspectives, again, depending on the kind of project. If it involves groups of people or convincing groups of people of things, whether that's a marketing type of situation, you're trying to get something to kind of catch on or go viral, you're trying to convince an admissions committee or a committee at your school to think your project is worthy and to fund it, being able to see multiple perspectives, that flexible thinking, super important. And how about inhibitory control? Again, this one I feel like is often the most challenging one in kind of any situation in the world we live in today. But inhibitory control comes into play in the passion project planning process in a couple of ways. Resisting distractions, again, literal distractions like notifications and emails, and bigger picture distractions. You decide you're going to set out to do one project and other kind of shiny new ideas come along. Do you divert from your goal and go do something different? Or do you stick with that persistence towards the goal and achieve what you're trying to do? That may sound almost like it's in conflict with the previous slide about flexible thinking, right? So there's a balance here between these skills and kind of an interplay. You want to be flexible if something goes wrong, but not so flexible that you get completely diverted from your plan. And then being able to stay focused on your current step and kind of stick to a timeline. Let's talk a little bit about how executive function can help specifically with time management and distractions. Again, a big thing, something I could talk about for a long time. So how does executive function influence time management? And these are all true not only when you're trying to complete a passion project, but when you're trying to study for a calculus exam or write a history paper. Time management is kind of a key skill that underlies a lot of things that make you successful in school and in careers. So one key thing is keeping track of working memory, keeping track of steps and deadlines, remembering your priorities, again, holding those goals in mind. Those are all working memory types of tasks that help with time management. On the flexible thinking side, again, some of these overlap with the last one. How can you adjust your plans when schedules change, adjust approaches, shift between tasks? Inhibitory control, how can you avoid that overwhelming urge to procrastinate, resisting multitasking, pausing notifications. So here you can see different ways that executive function play into time management and how you structure your time. How about feedback? How does executive function help you handle feedback? So most any long-term goal or passion project is going to involve some sort of feedback loop, whether you're getting feedback from a teacher or a professor, your peers, your parents, the marketplace, all of those sorts of things. Having strong executive function skills is really key to being able to handle feedback. So let's talk about how each of the domains come into play. Working memory side, how does feedback relate to that? One is literally holding the details of the feedback in mind while you're revising. So if you've had a conversation with an advisor about how you can revise an essay or a project proposal, just literally keeping all of that in your head and being able to keep it in mind as you're going through the details of your essay or proposal can be challenging and is an executive function kind of a task. Remembering those suggestions without having to recheck notes, tracking changes, whether that's literally tracking changes in a document or tracking changes in another system so that that feedback you've been given doesn't get lost. So those are the ways that feedback kind of taxes and uses the working memory side of executive function. How about flexible thinking? Feedback's all about flexible thinking, right? So how can you reframe a comment that you get on your project that may come off as pretty critical and hurtful and not feel great into an opportunity? So how can you use that flexible thinking skills to kind of reshift your internal narrative? How can you consider different perspectives and pivot creatively when you're going through your project and hitting barriers and receiving feedback? Inhibitory control, how does that relate to feedback? Key one here is really pausing before reacting defensively. Again, inhibitory control is literally controlling or inhibiting something that you know you shouldn't do. When someone comes to you with a piece of feedback or a criticism, being able to pause and kind of take that suggestion on board and decide if you want to act on it or not without reacting defensively, that's a form of executive function skills. Resisting the urge to ignore suggestions that feel challenging and looking for ways to really stay focused on the improvement instead of getting sidetracked by different things along the way. last piece I want to talk about is just a few tips on how to start to map out a passion project. This is very high level. Obviously, it's going to vary a ton depending on the type of project you're doing, the timeline you have, that kind of thing. But let's start to think about how could those different executive function components that we've talked about start to kind of come together and crystallize into a plan for your passion project, and how can we sort of think about how they would work together. So this is just kind of a sample timeline. Again, very general and high level, but you're going to start with what's your goal, writing it down. If it's relevant to the goal, circling a clear due date. I want to achieve X by X date. There's a ton of power in just saying that out loud, and even more power in writing it down, posting it somewhere, sharing it with friends, parents, advisors. So starting with that goal is going to begin to be able to employ that working memory to kind of keep that goal in mind and continue to come back to it as you progress through your project. Then the next piece is to start to lay out all the steps, putting them in order, estimating time, which can be a really challenging thing. I went through a period of time in my life when I was a consultant, and so I was tracking my time all the time. When I later transitioned into a full-time leadership role, I discovered I was really good at knowing how long things take me from those couple of years as a consultant where I was tracking all of my time. Colleagues who had always been in sort of a full-time salary role would kind of have no idea how long things would take them. And so I'm still very good at estimating how long things take because I kind of built that muscle and built that habit. It's hard when you're doing something for the first time. To some degree, you're taking a guess. You have no idea how long something's going to take you. But just the process of laying out your steps and starting to take a guess. Okay, I think this first phase is going to take me a week. Next phase is going to take me 2 weeks. And kind of breaking it down is super helpful to kind of support your executive function as you're mapping out your project. Then the next step is to kind of create mini deadlines. So kind of go one level deeper. Okay, if your goal is to complete X thing by 2 weeks from now, how can you really lay them out in mini deadlines? And then in the next phase, really picking daily actions. Today, I'm going to do 30 minutes of focused work on my passion project, and I'm going to achieve X thing. The power of that to support your executive function is really high. You can do things like choosing an accountability buddy, which is, find somebody else who maybe is working on their own project. Could be a peer, could be a friend, could be a parent, an adult who is going to kind of be the person to check in on your goals, not to make you feel bad if you don't achieve them, but to help you have that accountability. You're sort of outsourcing some of your executive functioning to that person to then be able to check in on you. Really, really powerful way to help support your EF skills. And then anticipating obstacles. We talked about this a couple of times. Being able to start to think about right when you're at the planning phase, before you've even started, what are some roadblocks that could come up? What are the things that could go wrong? That's not to say you'll think of everything. There will for sure be things that come up that you didn't think of, that you'll have to use those flexible thinking skills to adapt to. But taking some time to start to anticipate those obstacles and, where possible, create backup plans around them. Super helpful part of the mapping kind of project planning process. And then as you start to get into your project and working through things, checking in back to that metacognition side, reviewing your plan, adjusting, using timers, realizing, okay, I planned these daily actions. It's Friday. I haven't done any of the things I planned to this week because I had extra practices for soccer, or my calculus exam took more time than I thought, or I got sick. How can you then readjust your plan, not give up, not just sort of let it slide, but think, okay, I was supposed to do XYZ. I didn't do those things for whatever reason. How can you adjust them into the next week, and being able to use that flexibility to adapt? And then, yeah, reflecting on how you're doing, being able to use those metacognitive skills to be self-reflective, to adjust to your project. And so, this lays it out as a straight timeline. It's never a straight timeline. It's a bit of a kind of wiggly timeline, or a circle where you kind of reflect and adapt. Then you might go back to number 2, lay out some more steps, create some deadlines and some actions, get to the check-in, realize something's wrong, go back to the beginning again. So this makes it look like a nice, neat, clean, linear process. That's not how real life works. It's more complicated than that. But I think thinking through a structure like this can help you start to map out how you want to get from your idea to your finished project or your goal. So if that seems interesting to you and you want to kind of put some of these principles into action, we're actually going to be running a live online course starting in October, focused on this specifically, but much more specific and concrete to each student's individual passion project or goal. So while we just went through some high level pieces, the course is really going to be about choosing your goal, your project, whatever it happens to be, and then applying some of the things we just talked about in a lot of detail to start to map out that project, because planning is the key to accomplishing all of those lovely things on those bios that Christina shared. All of those things came from strong executive function skills and careful planning. So that's the focus of the course. The focus of the course is not doing the project itself. The focus of the course is laying out a really great and strong kind of blueprint or plan so that you can then do the project on your own. So we'll talk through a step-by-step process. We'll talk through a bunch of really useful tools that you can use and kind of lay out a blueprint that you can then use both on a specific passion project and also on things like the college admissions process. That's a passion project in and of itself, right? Maybe not so passionate sometimes, but it's definitely a project with lots of steps and timelines and deadlines, and one that thinking through how you can manage that and how you can support your executive function skills will save you a lot of headaches through that process. And there'll be the option to connect with the student success managers at Kyros as well to then take your plan that will map out in these 6 sessions and then implement the project itself. So that's just a little bit about the course that we're running. It'll be 6 live online sessions. There's information on the Kyros website, and I would be super excited to have any of you join us.